Hello there tonight. We are going to walk very slowly through the fog of time into a place where justice was measured, not in verdicts, but in blades. We're going to step softly past the boundaries of what we think civilization should look like, into the quiet, chilling depths of something called Lingchi, the death of 1,000 cuts. And I'll be honest, you probably won't survive this. Not in spirit, anyway. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. Post your local time and where you're listening from. I love seeing how far insomnia travels. Now turn off the lights, maybe turn on the fan for some soothing noise, and let's get started tonight. It begins, as most things do, with power. Or more precisely, with the desire to hold on to power no matter the cost. Long before cameras, before courts, before prison sentences written in cold ink, there were rulers who learned that nothing commands obedience like fear. And fear, of course, is much easier to cultivate when it's made visible, when it can be heard screaming, watched, dying, witnessed, bleeding inch by inch beneath the sun. Lingchi was never just about death. Death comes swiftly, efficiently. A sword, a rope, a push from a height. Those are merciful. Lingchi wasn't interested in mercy. It was about spectacle. It was about erasing a person so slowly, so publicly, and with so much theatrical agony that their name would linger in whispers long after their body was gone. They say Lingchi first appeared as early as the Western Zhou dynasty, that's nearly 3,000 years ago, give or take a century lost to the vagaries of history. Back then, punishments were a form of storytelling. Cut off a nose and you're telling people what happens when you steal. Remove a foot and you're teaching a lesson about loyalty. But Lingchi wasn't for petty criminals. It was saved for the worst of the worst, or at least those considered worst by the people holding the knives. Over time, as China's dynasties rose and fell, so too did the severity of punishments. The Qin dynasty, you know, the one famous for uniting China and burying terracotta warriors, also had a fondness for harsh laws. They didn't invent Lingchi, but they certainly perfected the art of state cruelty. Historians still debate whether Lingchi was originally a purely judicial punishment, or if it started as something more ritualistic, even sacrificial. Some argue that its roots lie in the ancient belief that the body and soul are bound, and to sever the body was to sever the spirit's path to peace. Others suggest it was simply the ultimate form of public humiliation, evolving alongside other tortures, as rulers looked for ways to tighten their grip through fear. What we know is this. By the time of the Tang dynasty, Lingchi had a name, and names, as we've learned, carry power. It wasn't just execution. It was 1,000 cuts. 1,000 moments of pain stretched across minutes, hours, sometimes even days. And yes, the number was often symbolic rather than literal. Though there are recorded cases boasting of hundreds, even thousands of incisions, the reality was more often determined by the skill or malice of the executioner. Odd fact, the earliest Chinese legal codes often paired severe physical punishments with poetry. That's right. You might lose a limb and gain a stanza in your honor. Justice and art woven together in blood and ink. As dynasties shifted Tang to Song to Yuan, Lingchi remained a quiet constant lurking behind the palace screens. By the Yuan dynasty, which brought Mongol rulers into the mix, the punishment became more formalized. Records describe executions being standardized to 100 cuts. A neat number, manageable, still monstrous. But it was under the Ming dynasty that Lingchi truly flourished. Flourished in the sense that cruelty often does when unchecked power and paranoia fester in the same dark corners. The Ming emperors in particular seemed to find a certain satisfaction in the public theater of punishment. Eunuchs wielded immense influence. Whispered accusations could topple anyone. And when they did, Lingchi waited with open arms. Imagine it a public square, a wooden post, a condemned man bound not just by rope, but by fate. An executioner sharpening his knives beneath a sky bloated with curious eyes. Not to kill quickly. No, the first cuts were often small. The flesh of the chest, the muscles of the limbs. A slow unmaking designed to keep the heart beating for as long as possible. The final cut to the throat, the heart, the head only came when death was the only escape left. You weren't just dying. You were being erased piece by piece, your humanity stripped away as your body unraveled. And people watched, cheered sometimes, threw coins or insults, bought pieces of flesh according to some accounts to ward off evil or absorb the condemned's strength. This was punishment elevated to performance. But beneath it all, something deeper stirred. The understanding that pain could be wielded like a brush on the canvas of power. That fear could be etched not just into flesh, but into memory. And so Lingchi endured. Through centuries, through emperors and scholars and rebels and poets, through wars and peace and revolutions half-formed, because power once tasted is rarely surrendered. And there is no power quite so absolute as deciding how a person dies. Tomorrow we'll walk further into this shadow. But tonight let's pause here beneath this ancient sky, where blades glint beneath lantern light, and history breathes through trembling flesh. It's hard to imagine, isn't it? How something so brutal could ever have been given rules, instructions, a method. But Lingchi was never just random cruelty, it was a system, a ritual, a spectacle bound by steps as precise as a tea ceremony. Every slice was meant to say something, to the condemned, to the crowd, to the empire itself. You don't get to the point where 1,000 cuts is considered civilized without practice, without refinement, without tradition. By the height of its use, Lingchi was more than execution. It was performance art wrapped in silent screams and the slow peeling away of dignity. Picture this. It's morning. Early. The kind of gray dawn where even the birds stay quiet. A man is led through the streets, bound with ropes that bite into his flesh, past crowds that don't meet his eyes. Not out of mercy. Out of fear that recognition might tie their fates to his. He will be brought to a public square, or perhaps a dusty patch of earth outside the city walls. Somewhere people can gather, somewhere space allows cruelty to unfold in its full choreography. They strip him bare, tie him to a post, sometimes arms outstretched like a warning to the heavens, sometimes bound tightly behind, forcing the chest forward. Vulnerable, ready. The executioner steps forward, calm, professional. Knives sharpened the night before. Sometimes there's only one blade. Sometimes several, each chosen for a particular purpose. They are tools of the trade, after all. Historians still debate whether executioners were trained specifically for Lingchi, or if this was simply an extension of their usual duties. Some records speak of specialists, men who knew how to cut just enough to bleed, but not enough to kill, at least not right away. Others suggest it was considered an honorless task given to the lowest in the profession. What is certain is that it required skill, precision, a steady hand and a stomach hardened by repetition. The first cuts, small, delicate almost. The chest where flesh can be peeled without touching the organs beneath. The arms, the thighs. Muscle carved away like meat from bone. Slowly, carefully. Not too deep, not too fast. The goal was not immediate death. The goal was endurance, visibility, suffering drawn out until it became legend. Odd fact, in some regions, it was customary to begin with the removal of the nipples, a symbolic gesture stripping the condemned of masculinity, humanity, identity. Just another step on the path to erasure. As the hours pass, the body becomes something less than human, more than corpse. A canvas of pain, blood pools, skin hangs in tatters, muscles quiver in protest until they can't. The condemned screams, or doesn't. Some faint, some weep. Some bite their tongues until blood fills their mouths, choosing silence over humiliation. Some curse the emperor with their final breath. Most simply, endure. Spectators watch. That's the point. This is not private punishment. It's public warning, a theater of fear. Officials stand by faces carved from stone. Eunuchs whisper among themselves, noting reactions, tallying debts owed or paid. The crowd shifts, murmurs, gasps. Children peeking between sleeves. Vendors selling sweets. Life continues even as life ends. Sometimes, if the condemned had connections or money, there would be mercy. A bribe slipped to the right hand. A blade driven deep early, ending it quickly. The rest of the cuts, mere formality. Performance without suffering. A kindness disguised as cruelty. But not always. Not for traitors, not for murderers, not for those who offended the emperor personally. Their deaths stretched longer. Their agony became legend. By the end, the body hangs limp. Eyes rolled back. Mouth open in a scream that no longer reaches the air. Blood paints the ground in slow, sticky patterns. And then finally, a final cut. The throat. The heart. The head severed and held high if the crowd needs reminding of their place. And what then? The remains divided. Sometimes burned. Sometimes scattered. Sometimes buried without rites, denied the dignity of ancestor worship. A final punishment ensuring the soul wandered lost, unmoored from the family that might have prayed for it. Because this wasn't just about death, it was about obliteration, about turning a person into a cautionary tale so potent it echoed down generations. Lingchi wasn't practiced everywhere or often. It was reserved for the worst crimes or the most dangerous enemies. Treason, parricide, blasphemy against the emperor's divine right. Crimes not just of action, but of thought, of intent. It lasted for centuries, through dynasties that painted themselves as enlightened, through reforms and revolutions and emperors who spoke of virtue while commissioning torture, through poets who wept for the condemned and scholars who justified the cruelty in careful, measured calligraphy. Because fear lingers longer than laws, and there is power in making punishment visible. Tomorrow we'll talk about why this punishment cut deeper than flesh, why it targeted not just bodies, but beliefs. But for now, let's leave the square. Let's walk slowly, carefully through streets washed clean of blood, past doors closed tight against memory. Because some nights, survival is found not in watching, but in turning away. Bodies were not meant to be broken. Not like this. Not slowly, not deliberately, not with an audience measuring each scream against their own sense of safety. At least that's what tradition would have said. For centuries, Chinese philosophy held a quiet, steadfast belief. The body, hair, and skin are gifts from one's parents. To harm them unnecessarily was to dishonor not just oneself, but one's ancestors. This wasn't just Confucian sentimentality. It was woven deep into the fabric of family, of duty, of respect. To die whole was to pass peacefully into the afterlife. To arrive at the ancestral shrine complete in form was to assure your descendants you would watch over them with kindness, with favor. A body ruined in life, or worse in death, that was a soul destined to wander. Lingchi broke more than flesh. It shattered lineage. It severed ties beyond the living world. This is why for so many centuries it wasn't used lightly. To unmake a body so deliberately was to strip away every layer of dignity, physical, spiritual, familial. It wasn't just punishment. It was exile from memory itself. Historians still debate whether this conflict between Confucian ideals and legal brutality created tension in the courts that allowed Lingchi. Some scholars point to reformists who argued against it as early as the Song dynasty, citing morality, not mercy. Others claim that pragmatism always won, fear was more useful than virtue. But the contradiction hung heavy in the air. Imagine knowing that with each cut, you weren't just losing flesh, you were losing your place in the great invisible web of your ancestors. That your grandchildren would light no incense for you. That your name would be spoken only in whispers, if at all. Odd fact, in funerary traditions, even the placement of the body mattered. Hands folded just so. Head turned properly. Clothes arranged with reverence. Lingchi destroyed any hope of these rituals. There was no body left to prepare. No dignity left to preserve. For those condemned, this knowledge cut deeper than any knife. Consider the man who kneels in silence as his sentence is read. He knows his crime. Perhaps he is guilty. Perhaps he is not. In this moment, it hardly matters. What matters is the shape of his death and the shape his spirit will take after. He knows he will not be whole. He knows he will not be remembered kindly. And so fear nests not just in his bones, but in his bloodline. His family, if they survive, the disgrace will carry the shame. His name will be scratched from records, his portrait burned, his stories unwritten. This is a punishment designed to echo. Yet even within this cruelty, there were strange attempts at rules. Limits of a sort. Imperial edicts trying to balance severity with ceremony. 100 cuts, no more. Mercy allowed after a certain threshold. The final blow permitted to end things cleanly if the executioner was feeling kind. But kindness wasn't the point. The point was dissolution. By the Ming dynasty, Lingchi had become almost formulaic. Executions documented with chilling precision. Lists of cuts recorded like recipes for unmaking. First the chest, then the arms, then the thighs. The removal of flesh timed not just for spectacle, but for symbolism. Piece by piece, reducing the human form to fragments of offense, and the condemned reduced to less than human long before the knives touched skin. You might wonder why anyone would watch this, why crowds gathered, why officials stood nearby expressionless, why scholars recorded it without flinching. But fear is a powerful teacher. To see a man undone was to remind yourself of the cost of dissent, of betrayal, of ambition placed in the wrong direction. And somewhere in the audience, someone always took note. A rival who might reconsider a plot. A servant who might think twice before stealing. A neighbor who would hold their tongue longer. The emperor didn't need to attend. His presence was already felt hovering above the blood-stained post, wrapped in the silence of those who watched and dared not look away. Lingchi wasn't about justice. It was about control. Control of bodies. Control of fear. Control of the stories people told themselves about what was possible and what was not. And so even as reformists rose men like Liu Yu in the Song dynasty, who petitioned against the cruelty of such punishments, the practice endured. Because fear outlives reform, and because no dynasty has ever been eager to relinquish its sharpest tools, the condemned were not martyrs. They were not heroes. They were reminders. And as long as the empire stood, so too did the post, the rope, the knives. Until one day they didn't. But we're not there yet. Tonight, let's step away from the blood, from the whispers, from the weight of centuries pressing down through the blade's edge. Let's remember just for a moment that bodies were meant to be whole, that somewhere beyond these walls, someone still lights incense for ancestors who died at peace, that somewhere someone remembers how to live without fear. Even here, even now, power doesn't just sit on a throne wearing silk and jade. Sometimes it crouches low, watching from the shadows, sharpened into something small enough to slip between ribs or bloom across flesh in 1,000 quiet, measured cuts. Lingchi was never simply punishment. It was a message handwritten in blood. a performance staged with methodical cruelty, a theater of pain orchestrated for politics as much as for retribution. And politics, as we know, thrives in fear. The use of Lingchi wasn't random. It wasn't meted out like rain falling evenly across the guilty and the unfortunate. It was reserved, calculated, directed like a blade at those who threatened the fragile balance of imperial power. Treason, rebellion, corruption. Crimes of ambition, not accident. These were the offenses deemed worthy of such a slow public death. Historians still debate whether Lingchi truly prevented these crimes or merely provided the illusion of control. Some argue that fear held the empire together when loyalty faltered. Others suggest that brutality only deepened the rot beneath the lacquered surfaces of dynastic rule. Either way, it served its purpose. Imagine an official, powerful, ambitious, perhaps too bold for his own good. He oversteps, offends the wrong eunuch, defies the wrong edict. His punishment is not a quiet exile or a cup of poisoned wine. It is Lingchi. Why not? Because his death alone matters, but because his death must be seen, must be felt by those who might follow his example. The execution isn't hidden in some dank prison yard. It's staged in a square, a courtyard, a public place where whispers travel fast and memories linger longer than mercy. Eunuchs deliver the news. Officials write the edicts. Executioners prepare the knives. And the people watch. They watch not because they enjoy it, though some might, but because not watching is more dangerous. To turn away is to seem complicit. To seem complicit is to invite suspicion, and so the circle tightens. Fear feeding fear. Odd fact, during the Ming Dynasty, public punishments often coincided with festivals or market days. A grim sort of entertainment, wrapped in the banners of civic duty. Bread and circuses with fewer lions and more blades. There were infamous cases, names still whispered centuries later. Liu Jin, the eunuch, who flew too close to power's son and found himself stripped not just of title but of flesh. Over 3 days, hundreds of cuts, his body reduced to nothing more than a warning in human form. Or Yuan Chonghuan, the general betrayed by courtly jealousy, accused of treason where there was none. His death by Lingchi carried out with meticulous cruelty, even as history would later clear his name. These were not just executions, they were erasures. To be cut apart was to lose not only your life, but your legacy. Your name struck from records, your family shamed, your ancestors silenced. And yet for all this horror, the machinery behind it was cold efficient. Bureaucratic, petitions signed, permissions granted, lists drawn up, witnesses arranged. The emperor distant atop his throne rarely needed to see the blood to taste its effectiveness. His word was law, his displeasure fatal. Power moved through whispers, edicts, knives, through the careful choreography of punishment designed to remind everyone where they stood. Below, always below. But even within this cruelty there was hierarchy, privilege, exceptions. A bribe to a eunuch might hasten death. A favor owed might lessen the cuts. A family's wealth might buy silence where otherwise there would be screams. Justice here was not blind. It was sharp-eyed and sharper still in execution. And so the condemned became part of a cycle older than any one dynasty. A cycle of fear, obedience, survival. One life ended to preserve thousands. One body broken to maintain the illusion that power was eternal, unshakable, divine. But illusions fray. Empires crumble. Even the sharpest knives dull with time. The politics behind Lingchi could not protect it forever. Not from reform. Not from foreign eyes. Not from the slow, relentless march of change. Still for centuries it held. Held through rebellion and famine, through corruption and conquest. Held because fear, once rooted deep enough, takes generations to wither. And somewhere even now in the quiet corners of history, where no light reaches, someone remembers. Remembers the names, the faces, the screams swallowed by silence. Remembers how power once wore a butcher's smile and called it justice. But tonight, let's leave those shadows behind. Just for now. Let's step away from the post, the knives, the watching crowd. Let's walk slowly, softly back toward the edge of light. Because there's more to this story. More to the people who held those knives. More to the eyes that watched. And tomorrow we'll look at them more closely. It's easy to forget the people who make cruelty possible. Easy to focus on the condemned, on the spectacle, on the crowd murmuring at the edge of the square. Harder somehow to look at the ones who hold the knife. Harder still to understand them. But Lingchi didn't perform itself. Someone had to tie the ropes, sharpen the blades, make the first cut, and the second, and the 100th. Behind every brutal system is a web of people who make it function. In the case of Lingchi, it was eunuchs, executioners, scribes, officials, each playing their part with practiced detachment. Start with the eunuchs. They're always there in the margins of Chinese history, aren't they? Whispering at court, carrying secrets in lacquered boxes, writing their power in invisible ink between edicts and appointments. They ran the forbidden city's inner workings, controlled access to the emperor, decided who rose and who fell. And when a punishment like Lingchi was ordered, it was often a eunuch's hand delivering the sealed command. Historians still debate how much influence eunuchs truly held over matters of life and death. Some argue they were mere messengers, pawns themselves. Others suggest they pulled more strings than the emperor realized, shaping policy, deciding fates. Either way, their fingerprints are all over the machinery of punishment. Odd fact, some eunuchs, despite their closeness to power, lived lives of profound isolation. Feared, mistrusted, despised. Their loyalty bought at the price of their bodies. Their humanity often questioned. Perhaps that's why cruelty became currency in their world. Why they learned to wield fear as deftly as a blade. Then there were the executioners. Not the faceless brutes of legend, but men with names, families, routines. Their profession marked them socially untouchable, spiritually polluted, but necessary. Their tools, knives honed to surgical sharpness, ropes soaked in water to hold tighter small blades reserved for the slow work of unmaking a person. This wasn't just a job, it was a craft. Precision mattered. Pain mattered. The goal wasn't death, it was endurance, visibility. A lesson written in blood that the living would carry home like smoke on their clothes. An executioner skilled in Lingchi could stretch a death across hours, could read a body's limits better than any doctor, could carve flesh without striking bone-peel skin, without spilling life too quickly. And for this, they were paid. Poorly, usually, but paid nonetheless. A trade like any other in a world where trades were all that stood between survival and starvation. Some records suggest executioners trained apprentices passed down techniques like blacksmiths or tailors. A lineage of cruelty hidden beneath the fabric of society. Fathers teaching sons where to cut, how to listen for the change in breath that signaled endurance fraying into death. Imagine that. Your family trade written not in iron or silk, but in screams. And yet they ate. They lived. They married when they could. They buried their dead and lit incense like everyone else. They just carried more ghosts than most. Officials watched, not just to witness, but to ensure order, to make certain the sentence was carried out as decreed, to confirm that law remained unbroken even as bodies broke beneath their gaze. They stood at the edge of the square in embroidered robes, fans fluttering faces unreadable, not participating, not intervening, simply observing. Because power requires witnesses, you might wonder how they justified it, how anyone did. But justification is easy when wrapped in silk, and sealed with imperial authority. Treason deserves no mercy. Rebellion warrants no pity. Justice, they said, must be seen to be believed. And so Lingchi endured not just through blood, but through bureaucracy, through scrolls signed and stamped, through appointments made and carried out, through men who sharpened knives and men who watched, and men who wrote it all down in ledgers bound for archives no one would read. The condemned died. The executioners washed their blades. The eunuchs carried reports back through silent corridors. The officials returned home, perhaps to tea, perhaps to wives, perhaps to quiet dreams, untroubled by the screams they'd heard. And life continued. Because cruelty, once institutionalized, becomes mundane, becomes part of the day's work, becomes just another task to complete before dusk falls and the lanterns are lit and supper is served. This is how horrors survive. Not through monsters, through men, through routines, through the slow, grinding machinery of power maintained at any cost. And somewhere beneath the surface of history, the echoes linger. The eunuchs are gone now. The executioners' knives dulled and rusted into artifacts. The officials' ledgers moldered into dust. But the system they upheld, the belief that fear is stronger than hope, that control requires spectacle, that the body is merely another tool of the state that lingers. Lingers in laws, in prisons, in the quiet acceptance of violence so long as it serves order. But that's a thought for another night. Tonight, let's leave these men to their shadows. Let's step away from the knives, the ropes, the bloodied posts. Let's walk quietly past their ghosts, out into the cool air where the moon still rises, indifferent to human cruelty. Because others watched too, from beyond these walls, from across oceans, from places where knives cut differently but no less sharply. And tomorrow we'll follow their gaze. Foreign eyes arrived late to Lingchi. By the time the West began to look eastward in earnest with its missionaries, diplomats, explorers, and opportunists, China had already spent centuries perfecting the art of quiet terror. Lingchi wasn't new. It wasn't hidden. But suddenly it wasn't just Chinese eyes watching anymore. The Westerners came with their notebooks, their sketch pads, their fascination wrapped thinly in the silk of curiosity and superiority. They called China barbaric, backward, grotesque, all while scribbling every detail down to bring home like gruesome souvenirs. Historians still debate whether the outrage was genuine or performative. Did they truly recoil in horror, or did they simply recognize an opportunity to paint the East in darker colors for their own political gain? What is certain is, this Lingchi became a symbol, not just of Chinese cruelty, but of China's supposed need for Western Enlightenment intervention and eventually conquest. The missionaries saw it as proof of moral decay. The diplomats saw it as leverage. The journalists saw it as copy that would sell papers in London, Paris, New York. And somewhere beneath it all, the condemned still bled. Odd fact, the first known photographs of Lingchi were taken not by Chinese officials, but by a French soldier stationed in Beijing. These images, grainy and gray, would circulate in Europe with breathless captions fueling outrage and fascination in equal measure. Photography changed everything. A painting could be dismissed as exaggeration. A story could be softened by distance. But a photograph made it real, made it undeniable, made it horrifying in a way that words could never quite capture. And so Lingchi, this ancient punishment rooted in Confucian contradiction and imperial paranoia, found itself dragged into the modern world on sheets of silver nitrate. Western critics pointed fingers. How could a nation that claimed to revere harmony, balance, ancestor worship commit such atrocities? How could they speak of Confucius with one breath and slice a man to pieces with the next? They did not see, or did not care to see, the hypocrisy in their own punishments back home. The nooses, the guillotines, the prisons where suffering was measured not in cuts, but in years. Pain wears many faces, but in China by the dawn of the 20th century, pain was still public, still sanctioned, still stitched into the fabric of justice, until it wasn't. Pressure grew. From within, reformers whispered of change. From without, foreign powers demanded it. The Qing dynasty, already crumbling beneath the weight of its own decadence and decay, faced choices it no longer had the strength to refuse. Lingchi became a bargaining chip, a promise of progress, a sign that China could modernize, could civilize, could shed the skin of its brutal past, and step forward into the light of the 20th century. And so in 1905 it ended. Officially, publicly, finally. But not before one last act, one final performance. A young man accused of killing his master was sentenced to Lingchi just weeks after the decree banning it had been signed. Bureaucracy moved slowly, or perhaps cruelty refused to die quietly. Either way, the knives came out one last time. Photographers were there. Westerners, Chinese, curious onlookers from a world already shifting beneath their feet. They captured it all. The ropes, the blades, the blood. The face twisted in pain or resignation. These images would circle the globe, end up in medical textbooks, psychology lectures, art exhibits. Proof not of China's barbarism alone, but of humanity's endless fascination with the edges of suffering. Some of these photographs were even turned into postcards. Sold, traded, sent through the mail like grotesque mementos of a vanishing world. Imagine receiving that. A friend writing from the east, wish you were here. Saw a man die by inches. The weather's lovely. Cruelty commodified. Pain packaged for consumption. History frozen in silver and ink. And beneath it all, the same lesson Lingchi had always taught: power holds the knife. The body cannot resist. But the world was changing. Empires cracked. Thrones toppled. Cameras captured what could no longer be denied, and in doing so helped bring about the end of things thought eternal. Lingchi faded, the posts dismantled, the knives dulled, the squares emptied of their crowds. But the photographs remained, and so did the questions. Why do we look? Why do we watch? Why does pain draw us in, horrify us, captivate us? What does it say about us that we keep these images, these stories, these echoes alive? There are no easy answers. Only the certainty that where power exists, so too does cruelty. Where cruelty thrives, someone will watch, and someone somewhere will remember. But tonight, let's turn away from the cameras. Let's leave the photographs in their dusty albums. Let's walk away from the squares and the knives and the silent witnesses scribbling in their notebooks. Because Lingchi's story doesn't end here. Not quite. One more breath remains. One more echo in the dark. Tomorrow we'll follow it to its final gasp. The last breaths of Lingchi did not come with a grand proclamation or a public spectacle. They did not arrive beneath the blare of trumpets or the weight of solemn ceremony. Instead, they came quietly, like the closing of a heavy door at the end of a long, dark hallway. Not with mercy, but with exhaustion. By the turn of the 20th century, even the most tradition-bound officials within the Qing dynasty understood that the world was changing. China's gates, once firmly shut against the chaos beyond, had been forced open. Western influence poured in, sometimes in ink, sometimes in blood, sometimes in whispers wrapped in silk. Foreign newspapers reported on China's lingering barbarism with a sneer. Missionaries condemned Lingchi as evidence of a nation hopelessly mired in cruelty. Diplomats used it as leverage, demanding reforms in exchange for favors. And within China itself, there were those who had begun to speak out. Not loudly, for loud voices rarely lasted long in an empire so delicate, so frayed by internal rot, but persistently. Scholars, reformers, men of law and learning who believed that cruelty shamed the nation more than it strengthened it. They wrote essays. They presented arguments. They pointed to the cameras, the foreign cameras, that captured every drop of blood with morbid fascination and sold it back to Europe as proof of China's backwardness. Historians still debate whether the abolition of Lingchi was born of genuine moral reflection or simple political necessity. Whether the Qing court, weakened and wavering beneath the pressures of modernity, sought to save face before the eyes of the world, or whether enough officials had finally grown weary of presiding over spectacles that no longer served their purpose. What is certain is this. In March of 1905, an imperial edict declared Lingchi abolished. No more executions by 1,000 cuts. No more public dismantlings of flesh beneath the watchful gaze of crowds and eunuchs. No more knives carving history into the skin of the condemned. Odd fact, this decree was issued just months after photographs of a Lingchi execution had once again made their rounds through Europe's newspapers and lecture halls. Some say it was coincidence. Others say it was the final nudge, the undeniable evidence that change could no longer be postponed. And yet, bureaucracy moves slowly. Cruelty moves slower. In the same year that Lingchi was abolished, it happened again. Almost as if the decree hadn't been written at all, perhaps because it hadn't yet reached every corner of authority, or perhaps because habit dies hard and blood dries slowly. The man's name was Fulu, a guard from Mongolia accused of murdering his master, a prince. His crime was severe, his punishment predetermined. Whether he was guilty or not, history offers no firm answer. It doesn't care much in the end. What history remembers is this: he was sentenced to Lingchi. The execution took place in Tianjin 2 weeks after the law said it shouldn't have. He was tied to the post. The knives came out. And standing nearby, camera in hand, was a French photographer. Photography had changed everything. A painting could be dismissed as exaggeration. A story softened with retelling. But a photograph made it real, made it permanent, made it portable. The photographer captured it all. 12 images in total, each one more harrowing than the last. Fulu's face frozen in agony and resignation, in something too deep for words. His body unmade piece by piece beneath the cold, indifferent gaze of history's lens. These photographs did not vanish into archives or family albums. They became postcards, sold openly in Tianjin markets, passed from hand to hand across Europe and Asia, sent through the mail like curiosities, like proof, like warnings. Wish you were here, written in ink across the blank spaces beneath a man's dying face. Imagine receiving such a thing. Imagine tucking it into a drawer beside letters from loved ones and recipes for stew. Imagine showing it to a neighbor, to a child, to a scholar, eager to understand the limits of human cruelty. Cruelty commodified, pain packaged for consumption, history frozen not in reverence but in fascination. The images lingered. They appeared in medical textbooks, in psychological treatises, in debates about punishment and power. They hung on gallery walls beneath the scrutinizing gaze of academics and artists. Proof of something dark and ancient and finally gone. But was it gone? Lingchi as law ended in 1905. But cruelty does not evaporate when decrees are signed. In rural corners of a vast country where emperors' words traveled slower than whispers, stories persisted. Justice delivered not by courts, but by villages armed with knives and grudges. Revenge disguised as righteousness. Pain mistaken for order. The language remained too, in curses and threats, cut by 1,000 blades still spoken in anger, in fear, in jest. A memory embedded in speech long after the knives were laid to rest. Even in silence, Lingchi breathed. In the photographs tucked into museum drawers. In the academic papers dissecting suffering like a specimen beneath glass. In the way the world still looks at pain, fascinated, horrified, unable to turn away. And somewhere someone still wondered, how could they do this? How could anyone? The answer was always the same. Because they could. Because power permitted it. Because control demands spectacle. Because fear makes good fertilizer for obedience. Lingchi's final breath was not a scream. It was a sigh. A slow exhale as the empire crumbled, as laws changed, as the world moved on and left its victims behind. But the echoes remained. Tonight, let's leave those echoes behind. Let's turn from the postcards, the photographs, the silent witnesses pressed beneath glass. Let's step away from the knives and the ropes, and the ghosts stitched into history's darkest corners. Because even cruelty must sleep. Even horror must close its eyes. Even stories like this must end. And tomorrow we'll end it properly. With one last thought beneath the weight of all these silent cuts. What lingers after 1,000 cuts? You might think it would be nothing. That after so much pain, so much loss, so much meticulous dismantling of body and dignity, all that would remain is emptiness. Silence. Ashes. But history is never so neat. Lingchi may have ended in 1905. The posts dismantled, the knives retired. The crowds dispersed back to their homes and hearths. But cruelty leaves a stain that doesn't wash away with decrees or time. It seeps into stories, into language, into the quiet places where fear takes root and grows. Even now, over a century later, the echoes of Lingchi hum beneath the surface of conversations about punishment, about control, about what it means to own a body yours or someone else's. Historians still debate how deeply Lingchi shaped China's cultural psyche. Some argue it was just one cruelty among many, a relic of a brutal era best left forgotten. Others suggest it cast a long, thin shadow over how pain, obedience, and authority were understood far beyond the emperor's reach. And beyond China, the West consumed those photographs, those stories with a hunger it never quite admitted to. They became evidence of barbarism, proof that East was still other, still savage, still in need of saving. Never mind the gallows, the stocks, the prisons, the burning fields left behind by so-called civilized nations. Odd fact. In the years after Lingchi's abolition, those infamous photographs resurfaced in the strangest places. Not just textbooks, but art galleries. Not just lectures on criminology, but exhibitions on surrealism. Artists and scholars peered at the frozen face of a man unmade and called it profound, transformative, sublime. Pain elevated into art. What does that say about us? About our fascination with the edges of endurance. About the stories we choose to keep telling even when we pretend we've outgrown them. Because we do still tell them. We tell them in whispers about black sites and torture chambers. In headlines about executions carried out in the name of law. In debates about whether punishment should break the body to shape the soul. We tell them in the way we still look at violence, unable to look away. Lingchi lives on, not in practice, but in metaphor. In the idea of being undone piece by piece. In the language of slow destruction. In the way fear settles into the bones of a people and makes itself at home. And perhaps that's the true legacy. Not the knives, not the blood, not the photographs pinned beneath museum glass, but the understanding that cruelty once invented is hard to forget. Harder still to unlearn. The body broken teaches lessons long after the flesh has healed or vanished. We see it in how justice is measured, in how power defines itself, in how silence is maintained through the quiet threat of suffering made visible. Even in places where Lingchi never touched, its echoes remain. In systems built to humiliate before they punish. In policies designed to strip dignity before they take life. In the way some punishments are staged not for justice but for spectacle, because that was always the point. Visibility. Fear turned outward, displayed like a banner beneath a gray sky. a lesson for the living carved from the bodies of the condemned. And even now we haven't learned. Not really. But perhaps we can. Perhaps in telling these stories not to glorify, not to shudder, not to sensationalize, but to understand, we take a step away from the knives, away from the ropes, away from the posts waiting in some shadowed square. Perhaps in remembering we resist repeating. Lingchi ended in 1905. Officially. Finally. But cruelty endures where it is allowed to. And kindness, like silence, requires practice to survive. So tonight, as we close this story, let's leave the square behind. Let's step away from the blades and the crowds and the whispers curling through history like smoke. Let's walk instead toward quieter things, toward softer hands, toward mornings where no one must count the cuts before they can breathe, because we deserve better stories, because we deserve to tell them. Let this be the last cut. Let it be enough. And now, as we let this story rest, let's slow everything down. Slow your breathing. Let your shoulders ease away from your ears. Let your thoughts drift like soft clouds pulling loose from the weight of history. There's no need to carry these images with you into sleep. Let them settle, fade, dissolve. Let them become distant like a lantern dimming in the fog. What happened then does not have to happen again. That's the quiet hope we carry forward each time we look back. So tonight, you can rest. You can let go. No knives here, no ropes, no watchers hidden behind silk screens. Only stillness, only breath. Only the slow, gentle slide into dreams where you are whole and safe and seen. Thank you for listening. Thank you for walking with me through such a dark place. Good night.